Broadly speaking, intellectuals in the 17th century began to increasingly reject accepted authority and religious dogma. There was a desire to question everything that was originally taken to be true. René Descartes, who is pictured here, was one of the key thinkers that exemplified this new spirit of intellectual pursuit, and in his work reflects almost the antithesis of the natural philosophers we discussed in our last class. Descartes was a French intellectual who, in his quest for what he called certain knowledge, or knowledge that was objective and irrefutable, rejected the authority of ancient texts. He argued that knowledge could only be based in one's experience, that you had to have direct observation and an experimental knowledge of something in order to know for sure that it was true. Descartes developed a new system to determine this truth, and a method that closely resembles what we conceive of as scientific. He wrote, "The first rule was never to accept anything as true unless I recognized it to be evidently such." So he emphasizes personal experience. That is, carefully to avoid precipitation and prejudgment, and to include nothing in my conclusions unless it presented itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind that there was no occasion to doubt it. The second was to divide each of the difficulties which I encountered into as many parts as possible and as might be required for an easier solution. The third was to think in an orderly fashion, beginning with the things that were the simplest and easiest to understand, and gradually by degrees reaching toward more complex knowledge, even treating as though ordered materials which were not necessarily so. The last was always to make enumeration so complete and review so general that I would be certain that nothing was omitted. So this method reflects a new way of thinking about the world, with a focus on rationality, method, and utility. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher and argued against scholastic ideas that the world was controlled by good and evil spirits. He argued rather that it functioned more like a machine in accordance with immutable laws. This was known as mechanical philosophy and denied the role of corporeal spirits. God created the world, a world that is knowable as rational, but then left it to run on its own laws that we can discover through experiment, not through revelation. So for him, you didn't necessarily need God to explain the universe and how it works. It had its own rules. God set the world in motion, but once it was in motion, it followed its own set of rules from the beginning. Like Descartes, he argued that all that we can know with certainty is that which we have experienced ourselves through our senses. So the 17th century brought a more experimental regime where scholars attempted to uncover the hidden workings of nature and the universe through their laws of systematic experiments rather than mystical pursuits or experiences. The ideas of these thinkers who represented the new experimental science were often rejected when they were originally circulated. We can think here of Galileo, who was persecuted for his acceptance of the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than basing his ideas on the Earth as the center of the planetary universe. When these scientific discoveries were first made, they can be seen at least to contribute to the witch craze because of how much anxiety they represented, how they created anxiety within people. The world was uncertain, unknown. However, by the 18th century, there was enough consensus about these new discoveries that actually helped to end the witch craze. The universe was no longer unknowable, but became more predictable again. The 17th century also brought a decline in religious zeal, to a certain extent at least. This was no longer the time of the Protestant and Catholic reformations that we originally were talking about, and there were few religious wars after 1650. From this notion comes a new idea of public and private. Religion becomes part of the private sphere, and the public is more concerned with social and political questions. So there's a separation between politics and religion. Some voice the opinion that a political polity did not need to be religiously unified, and many abandoned the idea of a godly state. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that men enjoyed a natural equality which should be reflected in a government formed from the general will of the public. Women, of course, are excluded from this. However, it's an important step forward in terms of, he argued that there should be a freedom of speech and that people should not be condemned for disagreeing with the majority. So we see throughout this time a general secularization of society. There was also new ideas of religious tolerance that emerged from thinkers, for instance, like John Locke, who was perhaps one of the most important and influential intellects during this time. He wrote a treatise called On Toleration, which kind of helps us to think about how the world has changed into this moment. So he says, if anyone maintain that men ought to be compelled by fire and sword to profess certain doctrines, and conform to this or that exterior worship, without any regard had unto their morals, if anyone endeavor to convert those that are erroneous unto the faith, by forcing them to profess things that they do not believe, and allowing them to practice things that the gospel does not permit, it cannot be doubted, indeed, but such a one is desirous to have a numerous assembly joined in the same profession with himself, but that he principally intends by those means to compose a truly Christian church is altogether incredible or unfeasible. The toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the genuine reason of mankind that it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as not to perceive the necessity and advantage of it in so clear a light. I esteem it above all things necessary to distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion, and to settle the just bounds that lie between the one and the other. If this be not done, there can be no end put to the controversies that will be arising between those that have, or at least pretend to have, on the one side a concernment for the interest of men's souls, and on the other side a care of the commonwealth. The commonwealth seems to me to be a society of men constituted only for the procuring, preserving, and advancing their own civil interests. So you see here this expression of the distinction between the concerns of the commonwealth versus the concern for the soul. They should be two distinct things. So the key idea here is the separation of church and state, and the limits that should be imposed on the state in regulating the internal beliefs and consciousness of the citizen. And this is a new idea at this time. At the same time, the theory that the state was a sacred realm with the king exercising power by divine right lost much of its pervasive force throughout this time. This is perhaps demonstrated most powerfully through the example of Charles I, Charles I in England, who was executed in 1649 by members of his own parliament. Although scholars debate about the motivation for his death, whether it was political or religious, it still demonstrates a rather different worldview than what we had seen up until this point. His execution is depicted here. So generally there was a growth of the centralized state, and it begins to take on certain modern characteristics that we would recognize. Although European nations still had monarchs and were not yet democratic, there was beginning to be a new relationship imagined between the citizen and the state, a new idea about what political power meant and about what limits should be placed on it. In addition to changing ideas amongst the more elite members of society, there are also a number of social and economic changes that began in the middle of the 17th century that supported the decline of the witch trials. Wages improved, there were agricultural innovations that increased the amount of food that was available for people, and a number of countries instituted poor laws, so laws of the parish to take care of the poor members of their communities. So there were social institutions available to care for the poorest members of society. So what about women? Did changing ideas about women's nature in any way contribute to the decline of the witchcraft trials? Because as we've talked about, this is sort of central to a lot of witchcraft beliefs. So in some ways, things got a little bit better for women, and ideas did indeed change about women's natures, more broadly speaking. The Enlightenment period opened up new spheres of learning. rising literacy and a general growth in the types and amounts of reading material that were available. There was a growing reading public. The inexpensive printed pamphlets that we've looked at, to a certain degree, they became more widely available. And something called the salon was established, which was a space where both men and women came together to discuss learned ideas. They were one of the primary mechanisms used to communicate ideas during this time. And they were thought that men had to tailor their behavior in order to engage in what was considered this feminine space of the salon. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft published The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which argued for the importance of women's education so that they could be rational and productive members of society. In it, she wrote, "Contending for the rights of woman, my main argument is built on this simple principle, that if she not be prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge. For truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice." So although these spaces of the salon were limited to higher classes, we can generally see a shift in ideas here about women. In addition to this, women were no longer thought to hold secret knowledge or to be quite so dangerous in this respect anymore. We talked about this in relation to a number of issues in relation to women. In part, this had to do with growing knowledge in the domains that were once considered the sole sphere of women. So, for instance, birth. Women were generally pushed out of the delivery room, and birthing techniques become more mechanized. For instance, the use of forceps to assist in more difficult births. And men largely take over the sphere, what was once the sphere of women. So the secrets of generation and nature are not so secret anymore. So women weren't really considered to be the danger that they had once been thought of, especially at the beginning of the witch hunts. They were no longer seen as sexual, and there were changing notions of the sexuality of men and women during this time. You see the emergence of the idea of being feminine, and a shift in concepts about the ideal woman. Women are thought to be delicate, sensuous, but not dangerous. However, in many ways, women aren't terribly better off at the end of the witch hunts, and changing notions about women's nature did not hugely contribute to the decline of the witch trials. Simply that women were more likely to be deluded about their own powers, and that they were more likely to be melancholics and suffer from hysteria was what became the predominant ideas about women throughout this time. The idea of the Victorian woman, who was frail and fragile, in need of care from a man. Her sexuality is restrained and suppressed, and men become characterized as the more sexually insatiable. So we see somewhat of a role reversal here in relation to gender and sexuality into the Enlightenment period. In conclusion, there really isn't one explanation for the decline of the witch trials. Perhaps that's not surprising to you at this point in this class. The various factors that I've discussed in this lecture all contributed to the decrease in their legal prosecution and the unwillingness on the part of the courts and legal authorities to take them to trial. Of course, this didn't necessarily mean that people, particularly the lower classes and common folk, believed in witches any less. But there was simply less opportunity for witchcraft beliefs to develop into formal accusations and trials against specific individuals.